Thank you, Dr. Kusumita, for these very kind words, and also to the Parliament of Religions for this invitation. I really feel very humbled, to be part of this very august gathering of religious leaders, and also to represent the Vatican and Pope Francis. And maybe at this point of the day you may be tired, so I thought I would also use some images, some slides for my presentation. I would like to begin. What I would like to really like to share with you is about Laudato Si, in as much as it offers a holistic understanding of the ecological crisis. I thought this, we are in a crisis. Our common home is in crisis. Humanity is in crisis. And I thought we can learn or begin with the wisdom of Gautama Buddha, the enlightened one. Buddha confronted the problem of suffering. That was the first step. But before he moved to act, to respond to suffering, he tried to understand what suffering is. That was a very important second step, understanding what the problem is. Then the Ashtanga Marga, the fourth, all those things followed, that we can overcome suffering, the third noble truth, and the fourth noble truth was the way to overcome suffering, the Ashtanga Marga. But the second step is crucial. I think as humanity, as religions, as we are all trying to respond to this crisis, it's very important to pause for a moment and understand this crisis so that we can really respond to it. That's what I would like to do in this session. Next slide, please. It's trying to offer, or I can do it. Laudato Si. Next slide, please. I'll go fast because we don't have much time. Laudato Si, which has been described as the most important environmental text of the 21st century, not by a priest, but by a lay scientist at the New York University, Dale Jamieson. And the previous slide, please. And I like this slide because, how Pope Francis was raised by divine providence. The story of Saint Francis. When he was a boy, thank you, that's a good solution. As a young person, he walked into the church of Saint Damiano, which is in very, very bad shape, and he heard the crucified Lord telling him, Francis, go and repair my house, which as you see is falling into ruin. Then we have Pope Francis coming onto the scene. The same crucified Lord tells him, Francesco, va e ripara la mia casa, Italian. Francis, go and repair my home. But this time, not just the crucified Lord, but also the indigenous chief, the polar bear, and the birds, everyone. I think Pope Francis came onto the scene raised by providence, so that our common home can be rebuilt. Some problem, the encyclical of Francis, Laudato Si, significantly carries the subtitle on care for our common home. It's not environment. In talking about Earth as our common home, Pope Francis ushers in a major paradigm shift. It is a crisis of our very common home. And let's see this crisis from three perspectives. The physical, because Pope Francis offers a holistic understanding of the crisis of our common home, the physical, ethical, and spiritual dimensions. Next slide, please. The physical dimension, the planetary boundaries, 2009, out of the 9 sectors, not just climate change, but also in nitrogen cycle, modern agriculture, biodiversity loss, and I think we are not speaking sufficiently about it. 10,000 times faster than the normal rate of extinction, species going into extinction. So we are beyond the security, the comfort zone, the green zone. Next slide, the same study update in 2015 added also land use change. So not that we are going to face, we are in the crisis. That's a physical problem. And someone mentioned this morning, Professor mentioned about the consumption of resources. By 2030, we require another planet, the way we are consuming our resources. Next slide, please. And again, the problem, who consumes? If we are to live, those like in Australia, US, we require nearly 5 planets. I think the planet still holds on because the poor are not consuming as much. Next slide, please. And IPCC report, last 1,000 years, the temperature change. Could I take a second on this? I think we need to educate our religious communities on this. Last 11,000 years, Earth's average temperature varied 1 degree. Last 11,000 years. Now, by the end of the century, even with the Paris Climate Agreement, we are walking towards 2.63 degrees centigrade. And scientists' latest report told us to remain within 1.5 degrees centigrade, we have 12 years. So imagine the magnitude of the change we are causing. Thank you. Next slide. And by the end of the century, how our planet could look like, well, what our children would inherit. Next slide, please. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis offers a masterly synthesis of the manifold manifestations of the contemporary ecological crisis, the crisis of our very home, pollution, waste, climate change, depletion of natural resources, especially water and biodiversity. This is a holistic perspective. Next slide, please. And I'm sorry I used we're outdoors. Surely no creature other than the human person has ever managed to foul its nest in such short order, said by Lynn White in 1967. Okay. But the second part of the crisis, an ethical crisis. We also need to remember that the early and disproportionate victims of the ecological crisis are the poor. Next slide, please. Next slide. These are things we are familiar with. Bangladesh. Children. Because the ecological crisis is a moral crisis. Next slide, please. This one study I always like to quote. That climate change, who causes it? According to Partha Dasgupta, and Dasgupta is an economist in Cambridge, Ramanathan in Berkeley, climate scientist, the top 1 billion people are responsible for 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. A further 3 billion people for 45%, while the bottom 3 billion, the poor, who do not have access to affordable fossil fuels, are responsible for a mere 5%. And they are the ones bearing that's why it's an ethical crisis. These are the map of the world. On the top, countries that emit greenhouse gases. We are in Africa. Africa is nowhere on the top part of the slide. Downside, same slide, previous slide, please. Down you see the mortality, people dying of climate change. Africa is so conspicuously, it's injustice. Next slide, please. And the causes, migration. Next slide, please. Bangladesh again. And Samoa, Fiji, Kiribati, Tuvalu, all these islands. We are not drowning, we are fighting. Samoa. According to Pope Francis, today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. The next slide. The crisis of our common home has at its roots some profound injustices in human relationships and cannot be overcome unless these injustices are addressed and redressed. Next slide. We also need to, this is the last thing, the third part, it's a spiritual, profoundly spiritual and religious crisis. Next slide, please. Pope Benedict already said in 2005, the external deserts are expanding because the internal deserts have become so vast. If the disharmony outside is because there's disharmony within. NASA said it in the US only 30, 40 years ago. Next slide. Creation is first of all, God's first and primordial revelation. According to Pope Francis, God has written a precious book, we have forgotten that, whose letters are the multitude of created things present in the universe. Creation is indeed the very first epiphany revelation of God, and we religions have forgotten that. Next slide, please. Caring for our common home is our original vocation. That's the first job description, Genesis 2:15. Take care of this garden. And that's our first job description. First task entrusted to Adam, the first human being, as we read in the creation narratives in Genesis. Very first commandment given to humanity. Next slide, please. In caring for our common home and for the weaker members of our common household, we are indeed imitating God's own loving, tender care towards all creatures. We are called, as the Pope indicates, to cooperate. What a noble vocation. To cooperate as instruments of God for the care of creation. each according to his or her own culture, experience, involvements, and talents. Next slide, and I'm going to end. And where religions, we can come together. And there's no options, no plan B. We have only one planet, we need to come together. And the very last slide, or two more slides, I think. The great urgency to act, and I want to conclude with the words of Pope Francis, the very last slide. We have only 12 years to go, and the last slide. This is really the last slide, I promise. Okay. What kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us? To children who are now growing up, to future generations. Thank you very much.